Welcome to Norse Nusantara, where I bring you voices in art and living heritage that define and disrupt ideas about the Nusantara, the world's largest archipelago. How is power defined in the Nusantara? This episode explores a compelling answer found not in treaties or battles, but in art. In this episode of Norse Nusantara, we are joined by Dr. Annabel Gallop, head of Southeast Asia at the British Library, to decode the power of the written word as it appears in two striking visual forms. That is, the manuscripts of the Qur'an and the early inscriptions of seals. One embodies spiritual authority and the other political might. By reading these visual forms, they reveal the nature of kingship, statecraft, and the intellectual spirit of its time. We explore how textual form crafted a unique paradigm of power in the Nusantara, one where devotion and authority were intertwined, where art itself defined the foundations of rule that still echo in the region today. Welcome to the show, Dr. Annabel Gallop. It's such an honor to have you on this episode of Norse Nusantara, which is dedicated to picturing the region through leading voices of visual culture. To begin, could you tell us about your role at the British Library as head of Southeast Asia and your specialization in Malay manuscripts, letters, and the art of the Islamic book?
Thank you, Noor. And first of all, thanks so much for inviting me on this podcast. And I really love your program because of the way it's really promoting Southeast Asia and its amazing civilization to broader audiences. So I think I have a dream job at the British Library, which is proven by the fact that I've been here for so long. So I was recruited to the British Library in 1986, probably before you were born, or most of our hearers were born. And I was recruited as the curator for Maritime Southeast Asia. And to this day, the title reflects quite accurately my responsibilities. So I look after the collection in the British Library of all the materials from island Southeast Asia, written in the languages of the region. So this covers all formats. It covers manuscripts, handwritten artifacts, but also printed books and journals, newspapers. And my responsibilities also include material right up to the present day. So I still buy modern books written in Malay from published in Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and works from the Philippines published in local languages like Tagalog and Visayan, any of the local languages. So the British Library is, of course, the National Library of the UK. We have one copy of every book published in the UK, but we also very much regard ourselves as a world library because we have collections probably from every single language in the world which has left written traces. There are many, many more languages, of course, which have very rich cultures, which have always been transmitted orally. But for those languages which have been written, you will find collections in the British Library. And I also think the British Library is quite exceptional amongst the national libraries of the world for having such a large cohort of curators responsible for these different languages, whether they're in Hebrew or Armenian or Arabic or Chinese, Japanese, Korean, coming back to Thai, Lao, and indeed Malay and Indonesian. So that's roughly the range of my responsibility. So it covers quite a wide range of material, and that's why the job sort of very much changes from year to year, from decade to decade. At some stage, I could be working on early Malay printing, for example, and then work on newspapers. And more recently, I've been working a lot on manuscripts, the manuscript collection in the British Library, whether in Malay or Javanese, and focusing on digitizing that collection because in order to make it as accessible as possible to our users who are found all over the world, including in Southeast Asia. But I do feel that my career is sort of coming around full circle because at the moment I'm coming back to printing, to early Malay printing. My first exhibition in the British Library was on early Malay printing back in 1989. And this year, thanks very much to the generous patronage of William and Judith Bollinger, who for a long time were based in Singapore, we are embarking on a new digitization project of early Malay printing, early Malay printed books from the British Library's collection, and that's in partnership with the National Library of Singapore. So I really hope that very soon you'll be seeing the results on your screens.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Gallop, for sharing the evolution of your practice. And it's nice to hear that it's coming full circle and the connection with Singapore. And speaking about coming full circle, and before we go into the rest of the questions, I'm quite intrigued about how your journey began right here in the Nusantara in quite an interesting way. Could you share about your early beginnings in the Nusantara?
With pleasure. And in some ways, you might think from my background and family history that, it's quite natural that I'm doing the job I am doing. But that's probably not entirely true. So I have very strong links with Nusantara. My mother is a Malaysian Chinese. She comes from Kedah, the northernmost state in Malaysia. And she comes from a very small town called Changlun, which is the last town in Kedah before the border with Thailand. My father was British. And I grew up in Brunei in Southeast Asia also, where my father was the principal and then a school inspector of local government schools. My mother was a kindergarten teacher. So, of course, I grew up in the region. I have family all over Malaysia and Singapore to this day. But I have to say the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is probably not, because of my family links. In fact, I have 3 sisters, none of whom work on Southeast Asia. But before I went to university in the UK, I spent a gap year, a year out doing voluntary work. And I taught English in West Java in a convent school, in Lembang near Bandung. And this was in 1979. And at the time, there was very little English spoken in Indonesia. But also I found it a very, very a mesmerizing experience. So I had grown up in Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. But going to Indonesia, I was part of the same linguistic and cultural world, but I was in a different dimension. It was a zone apart. And that, I think, opened my eyes to what an extraordinary area it was, and that's where I think my love and attraction for this reason, and the reason why I'm doing what I am today, it all stemmed from that experience when I was sort of 17, 18 years old in West Java.
Wow, thank you for sharing that with us. And let's get deeper. And one of the questions I ask every guest on the show is, how do you define the Nusantara? And you've provided this really amazing map right here as we guide this discussion. Could you share a little bit more about your definition?
Yes, of course. I love this map. It's one of my favorite maps because it's not just a map. It speaks volumes. And if you look at the title, it says, a map of the countries wherein the Malayu language is spoken. And to me, that is what makes Nusantara. And if you look at it, it's actually very, the boundaries of the map cover that whole linguistic and cultural area. So you've got the present day nations of Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, East Timor, but you've also got the southern Philippines, the southern islands of the Philippines, the southern parts of Thailand and of Cambodia. And that's really important because the Nusantara, it's an area which is linked primarily by language, in the sense that it's the use of the Malay language as a lingua franca. So there are hundreds of local languages in this region, from Achenese to Minang to Batak to Javanese to Dusun to Iban, Tausug in Sulu, Maranao in the southern Philippines. But when the different traders, rulers, statesmen, missionaries wanted to communicate with each other, they used the Malay language. And that's what unites this area. And it's largely also united by the faith of Islam. And obviously there are pockets. For example, Bali is the only Hindu majority island outside, location outside India to this very day. There are pockets which are primarily Christian or Buddhist, but it's by and large linked by the faith of Islam. And so that also leads to a not a homogeneity, but a shared manuscript culture, a shared book culture, intellectual history, and also shared elements of social, cultural, and political and religious practice. And so this map is from the first Malay English dictionary, published in London in 1701 by a seaman called Thomas Bowry, who worked for a sea captain who worked for the East India Company. And he published this dictionary in order to help primarily merchants trading to this area. And the first thing that they would have needed is the language, the Malay language, to enable them to communicate and trade in this area. So I love this map, and also it's just by coincidence. I grew up in Brunei, and you can see the very kind of beating heart of the map is located on Borneo and radiates out from there. But it really does, I think it sums up Nusantara in a wonderful way for me.
Yeah. And well, thank you for sharing this definition of Nusantara through the link of language. And that brings us to our next question, and how this episode also engages with your expertise on the power of the written form in manuscripts and seals in the Nusantara. So, diving in deeper, and for our listeners, could you share why the written word was so central in defining authority and identity in the region?
Well, I mean, in one way, there's a very easy answer to that, in that the earliest traces of writings from Nusantara, which have survived to this day, are perhaps not unnaturally. They are engraved, incised on permanent, immutable objects. These are stone inscriptions, and so the earliest examples of writing in Malay, for example, are stone inscriptions from South Sumatra, dating from the time of the Srivijayan Empire, and they are stone monuments issued by the king, the ultimate political authority, and they're primarily commemorating either the establishment of something or a boundary of a particular zone. And so our knowledge of language and the type of language that was used is very much linked to political authority in the region. The earliest examples so I've talked about the earliest examples of writing in a Nusantaran language, which is Malay, but there are in fact earlier examples of writing not in a local language but in Sanskrit. So there are 7 pillars inscribed in Sanskrit found in East Kalimantan at Kutai, which date back to the 4th century. And so that's also quite an important point, because Southeast Asia is a linguistically very, very rich area with hundreds of different languages. But the scripts that are used to write these languages, so that they have, they have left traces that we can read to this day, all the scripts are borrowed from different civilizations. There are no indigenous scripts that were created by the people of Nusantara themselves. So the earliest scripts that we know of are Indic scripts. They all derive from India, including, the inscriptions in Sanskrit in Kutai, but scripts which are still in use today, like Javanese, Balinese, even Batak and Bugis, they are derived from Indic scripts, so they read from left to right, and they share the same origins as the scripts in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Burma, and Cambodia. And the second big family of scripts are based on Arabic script, and that came with the arrival of Islam. So Malay, Javanese also, Achinese, Minang are written in Arabic derived script. So when we, as a sort of professional librarian, curator, historian, when you talk about written traces in the Nusantara, you have to think both of script and then of language. And of course, nowadays, throughout Nusantara, we use the Roman script. It's also another unifying force, and that has come from the West. And it just shows how the same language can be written in many different scripts over the ages.
Interesting. I mean, to see the evolution of the written form across the Nusantara and the written forms that we are focusing on today is deeply influenced by the Islamic world with the synthesis of the Malay. Before we look into the visual examples, could you just tell us how, when, and why did the Islamic influence have such an impact on the region's literary and visual cultures?
Yes, I mean, it's kind of like the million-dollar question. When did Islam come to
Right.
Southeast Asia, which has been debated endlessly? I mean, I think, it very much depends what you mean by when did Islam come to Southeast Asia, because it is really quite clear and apparent and historically proven that there were probably Muslims in Southeast Asia from the very earliest days of the faith, going back to the 8th or 9th century. And this is proven, like in Singapore, by this amazing tongue shipwreck, which is on display in your museum, in the Asian Civilizations Museum, which is a 9th century shipwreck of an Arab ship carrying a cargo from China, which was wrecked in near Belitung, off the coast of Sumatra, in the Southeast Asian waters, in the Nusantaran waters. So that shows that from the and this ship was actually made. It is proven from techniques and from the analysis of the wood, it was made on the Arabian Peninsula. So that shows from the very earliest days there was a steady trade, a stream of traders going from the Middle East to China through Southeast Asian Nusantaran waters and back. And of course, because sea voyaging was dependent on the winds, the monsoon winds at the time, you couldn't just set sail whenever you wanted. You had to wait for the right winds, which meant that Arab traders, Muslim traders, were spending time in Southeast Asia while they waited for the winds. And so we don't know everywhere in every single place and what traces they have left, but it's a historical fact that there must have been Muslims living, and one presumes practicing their Muslim faith, in little pockets in Southeast Asia from the earliest days of Islam. But one can treat Islamization or the coming of Islam in a different, more structured way, and that is with the conversion of kings, which led to the conversions of states, and that's sort of, ramping the game up a notch. And that we usually date from the mid-13th century, when the kingdom of Pasai on the northern coast of Sumatra became the first kingdom in Southeast Asia where the king converted and Islam was instituted as the religion of a state and a region. And so from that mid-13th century point onwards, Islam spread in a more institutionalized way across Southeast Asia over the next centuries. And one of the last kingdoms and last areas to convert in a major way was South Sulawesi, where the kingdoms of Goa and Talo converted, and Brunei also, only in the early 17th century, in from about 1603 or 4 or 5 onwards. So that's with the coming of Islam, it brought, of course, the Arabic script, the language of the Holy Scripture, of the Holy Book, the Qur'an, and it brought with it both very important political and economic advantages. By embracing Islam, Nusantaran people were part of a much larger, a broader political family, the Ummah, spreading across the world all the way back to the Middle East, and also they became pivotal players in economic networks which spread across the world. So it's not very surprising that these developments also impacted on the writing and the cultural practices in the region. And the coming of Islam brought, of course, the word of God in Arabic, written in the Arabic script, and very soon, concomitant with that, the Arabic script was adopted to write local languages in Nusantara.
And speaking about institutions and kings and statecraft, I want to turn to this monumental book by you, Malay Seals from the Islamic World of Southeast Asia, published by NUS Press and the British Library. It's nearly 1,000 pages long, and it's a landmark contribution. What inspired you to undertake this project, and what kept you going through such an immense task?
Well, thank you. Yes, it was an immense task, and I'm really grateful to people who recognize that, because it does represent about 20 years of work and research.
It's a library on its own.
Well, I don't recommend it as bedside reading, because I don't think your hand, it's not only 1,000 pages, it's pretty hefty as well. But it all grew out of my work in the British Library. I mentioned my first exhibition was on early Malay printing. My second exhibition was on it was called Paper and Gold, and it was on illuminated manuscripts from Nusantara in the British Library. And I was looking at our collection, and amongst the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts were Royal Malay letters. So they featured prominently in that exhibition, and also in an exhibition I then further did for Indonesia called Golden Letters, Surat Mas, in 1991, and another big exhibition for Malaysia called Warisan Warka Melayu, the legacy of the Malay letter, in collaboration with the National Archives of Malaysia in 1994. And that last Malaysian exhibition really focused just on Malay letters. And they are such fascinating, they're fascinating for all that, every single aspect was fascinating. You could do a PhD just on, say, the illumination or the calligraphy or the letter headings that were used, or on the seals. And actually, so I then embarked on a PhD on the seals, which grew out of my work on Malay letters. I got my PhD at SOAS, the University of London, in 2002, but it took me a very, very long time to get my catalogue published, which only came out in 2019, so nearly 20 years later, partly because it was such an enormous job. I'm extremely grateful to NUS Press in Singapore for keeping faith with me throughout this period. I must name Paul Kratoska, who many of you will know, who for many years was in Singapore at NUS Press, and he used to come to London to do his research as a historian at the British Library, and I'd have lunch with him every year or so. And every year he'd say to me, come on, because he had suggested I publish my catalogue with NUS Press, come on, Annabel, how's it going? And every year I would sort of slightly, sort of hunch down, but he kept up the pressure, and so I, was always focused on this. And I was also very blessed to, when I finally put my, absolutely sort of stuck my heels in and started working on it, it's an enormous amount of data to organize. And I had the most marvelous designer I could possibly have had. I mean, he was professor at Reading University in the Department of Typography, with a specialism in setting complex text, Paul Luna. So if it was Paul Luna who pushed and prodded and made them help me pull together the material in a way that could make sense and make it easier for people to navigate the book. It took us 2 years of working together just to finalize the design and the layout and put it together. And throughout this time, NUS Press and Peter Shoppert, by that time as director, waited patiently. And I'm absolutely thrilled it came out. It's also available in Indonesia through the Lontar Foundation. It's published there as well. So yes, I can't help but admit I do feel happy. I'm very happy and proud that it is actually out.
Yeah, and thank you for this gift of art history to the region, Dr. Gallop. And I tried looking it up online. I believe it's also sold out. So yes, it's become quite a rare artifact. Yeah.
I think in Malaysia and Singapore, the NUS Press edition is sold out, but it's widely available in Indonesia from the Lontar in Jakarta, from Lontar Foundation. It has a different cover, but the content is exactly the same. So if you can't get it in Malaysia and Indonesia, you can order directly from Lontar and Gramedia. So the big bookshop Gramedia now sells it in Indonesia.
Super. Thanks for the tip. And well, as we go into sharper focus, I like to, and also taking a leaf from your book on seals, we like to also look at the political role of seals, especially in relation to Singapore's history. And this relates to the succession of the Johor Riau Empire, where it's also a mesh with Sir Stamford Raffles' arrival. So I'd like to ask you about the seals, which is on the 1819 Singapore Treaty, especially that of Sultan Hussein Shah and Temenggung Abdul Rahman.
Yes, so what you see on the screen is a copy of the treaty. It's an iconic document for Singapore's history, of course, but it's also a very elusive document because what you see in front of you is just a black and white image, which is reproduced from an early book, a printed book. In recent years, certainly within the recent century, nobody has set eyes on or handled the original paper copy of the treaty, of which there must have been probably at least 2 or 3 copies, one for the British and one for the Malay partners, maybe even 2 copies, one for the Temenggung and one for the Sultan. And this is said to be the photograph of the copy found in Johor, so most likely coming from the Temengung's line, but where it is now and where the British copy is now, I mean, it hasn't been seen, but I would guess it's somewhere in India at the National Archives of India, perhaps because at the time the East India Company's headquarters were in Bengal, but it has not been traced there. So when you're looking at this picture, you have to imagine that the large seal in the middle above would have been red. So that is Stamford Raffles' seal. That is, as was typical for British seals of the time, it would have been stamped in red wax. Whereas the 2 seals below, which are black, are quite an accurate representation of how they would have looked on the original treaty, because Malay seals were stamped in lamp black. And the way of sealing was to hold the seal, which for a royal seal would have been a very beautiful object carved out of silver, less elevated or less important seals would have been carved out of brass, but they were made of metal. And the face of the seal would have just had a little bit of oil wiped over it, and the seal would then have been held over a lamp, a flame, so either just a candle or an oil lamp. And then the soot from the flame would have gathered on the face of the seal. And when there was the face of the seal, of this metal seal, the silver seal was completely covered in soot, it would have been stamped on the paper treaty, probably held, and we have an eyewitness description of the sealing of this treaty, held on a cushion so that the metal seal could reach all aspects of the paper. So the seal of the Temenggung and of Sultan Hussein are very accurate depictions of what they would have been like on the original treaty. Now, the 2 seals are, of course, extremely interesting from a political point of view. We know Temenggung Abdul Rahman was one of the grandees of the great kingdom of Johor Riau. He had been appointed, and he received his seal from the last sultan of the kingdom of Johor and Pahang and Riau and Lingga, that great area, Sultan Mahmud Shah. And so his seal is actually dated 1806, which comes back to which long predates the founding of Singapore. So he received his seal from the last sultan, Sultan Mahmud Shah, who actually died in 1811. And his seal is also, he continued to use the seal until the end of his life, because you also see on the screen a letter that he sent to Raffles in 1824, and he's still using that same 8-petaled seal. And even the wording on the seal can be compared with other great officers of state, like the Bendahara, who was based in Pahang. All those seals started with the same phrase, al-Wakil, so the representative of the Sultan, the representative of the Sultan of Johor. The Sultan of Hussein Shah is a very different matter, because we all know that it was quite a turbulent period in the history of the Riau Johor Sultanate, and that the ascension of Sultan Hussein Shah and his installation as Sultan was contested. There was also another contestant Sultan, Sultan Abdul Rahman, based in Riau itself. And it suited the British machinations, and probably also suited the very wily and very powerful Temenggung as well, to support the other Prince Hussein, Tunku Hussein, as the alternative contender for the throne of Johor, and to support his case to bring him to Singapore and to install him as Sultan, so that he would be in a position to sign a treaty with Stamford Raffles as the Sultan, to then allow the British to establish a settlement in a trading settlement in Singapore. So when we look at Sultan Hussein Shah's seal, it's a very traditional Malay seal, and it starts off in absolutely classic wording, Al-Wathiq Billah, so he who trusts in God, as Sultan Hussein Shah, the Sultan Hussein Shah ibn Sultan Mahmud Shah, son of Sultan Mahmud Shah, which is really important to show your pedigree and your inheritance from the last Sultan, Al-Marhum, so the late, and with the date on it. So it's a very classic, if you like, seal, but it was probably only made a few days before the signing of the treaty. It was probably, I mean, he was only installed as Sultan that week, and the seal would have been made for him in probably, it might even have been the first use of that newly made seal on this treaty. So it was probably made in Singapore, I would guess, by a master scribe, and Malay seals were made up by goldsmiths, by gold silversmiths, who would make up, who were used to working in precious metals, and it would have been made up to be stamped on this treaty.
Amazing. I mean, we're looking at practically the tools of statecraft is embedded in these seals. And well, from the seals, I like to turn to manuscripts, particularly the Qur'an. And before we get into the examples, could you share how Qur'ans from the Nusantara, like broadly, illuminate the societies that produce them, showcase the brilliance of the region, and also somewhat represent the pinnacle of book arts in Southeast Asia?
Yeah. Well, I've always been very interested in the visual side of things. I'm not a trained art historian, but when I came to the British Library, my eye was naturally drawn to beauty, to the most beautiful illuminated or decorated manuscripts and books in our collection at the British Library. And I started, so I think my first published article from the British Library in the British Library Journal was on Malay manuscript art, and I listed and reproduced images of all the decorated Malay manuscripts in the British Library's collection of about 100 manuscripts. It's not a very big collection, but I have to say, even at the time, I noticed that it was quite difficult to weave any sort of narrative around this rather sort of a hodgepodge of a collection of decorated and illuminated Malay manuscripts, things like the Hikayat Muhammad Hanafiya. We had a nice illuminated copy of a copy of Tajus Salatin, which is a very famous manual of statecraft. I've already mentioned the Royal Malay Letters, which some of them had illumination, not all. In some states there was a tradition of illuminating letters, in others not at all. So I, produced them, but I just knew it wasn't, there were no obvious sort of narratives or patterns arising from this material. And as I traveled more, particularly visiting Malaysia and Indonesia, and looked at manuscript collections in the region, I realized that the reason why it didn't make sense is I was looking in the wrong place. I was looking at manuscripts in Malay, and actually it was the manuscripts in Arabic from the region, primarily the Qur'an, which is where the finest works of art, of book art, were found. And of course, once I sort of realized that, it all absolutely made sense. I mean, the Qur'an is the holy book of Islam. It's the word of God on material manifested on paper. And it's quite naturally the book on which the most, the greatest resources, the greatest care and love and attention would have been paid to honor it through enhancing it with illumination and decoration. And also, there was another very important reason why it became such an important area to study, is that because it was the Word of God, there was very great care taken in the decoration. You couldn't just do anything. You couldn't just impose your own aesthetic ideas of what might look beautiful. there was very much a consensus of how the holy book should look and should be decorated, which meant that in each region of Nusantara, it became quite easy to see regional styles and regional preferences. And so with this kind of methodology, the whole sort of mapping of the manuscript art of Nusantara became much clearer. So at the pinnacle of the book arts of the region, in every single region, whether you are in Sumatra or in the peninsula or in Sulawesi or Java, the finest examples of illuminated manuscripts were Qur'ans, but there were also quite distinct regional variations. So,
and you have some examples.
And we have some examples on the screen. And the first one I want to show you, which is also the first one I worked on, because it's probably one of the most distinctive styles of art in Nusantara, is the Qur'an from Aceh. And the Aceh style of Quranic art is very, very distinctive. So you have, and Aceh is probably also the part of Nusantara where there are more illuminated Qur'ans available than anywhere else. I think coming out of all the many educational establishments in Aceh in the 19th century. So this is a very typical example. This is actually in the British Library, but there are very few. The Qur'ans I'm showing you, obviously I'm showing you what is held in the British Library, but nearly all the fine examples are not in Europe. They're in Southeast Asia itself, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. This is one of the only fine Qur'ans that we have from Aceh. So you can see that actually, although it's decorated, that the kind of the key color, if you like, is actually white in the decoration. It's not a white paint or white pigment. It's the white of the background paper, which has been left uncolored, and the other colors have filled in around it. So it's a color we call reserved white. And in Aceh, it's the most important color in the palette of the artist. So it's manipulated to produce these wonderful scrolling patterns. So, but if you want, if you really want to be wowed by beauty, we'll move on to the east coast of the Malay Peninsula, and in particular Terengganu. So this was the area that produced the most sumptuous, the most stunning works of art in their illuminated Qur'an manuscripts, and these are the finest in the whole of Southeast Asia. So this is a Qur'an held in the private collection of the late, great and much lamented Nurhaiza Nurdin, who was one of the great woodcarvers, master woodcarvers of the East Coast. And this, I saw this Qur'an in his private collection. And in fact, Terengganu Qur'ans were exported all over Southeast Asia in the 19th century because people, especially royal families all over the Nusantara appreciated these, and you can find them in the collections in Palembang, in Pontianak, in Bima, and in Java as well. But the east coast of the Malay Peninsula is a very long area. It stretches all the way down from Thailand down to Pahang, Johor, and into the Riau Islands. And there are other decorated styles of decoration along this coast. And the next slide shows a very exquisite little Qur'an from the only East Coast Qur'an in the British Library, which illustrates very well the Patani, what I call the Patani style, although one probably think of it as the whole area north of Terengganu, going up to Kelantan and Patani and into other parts of Thailand. So it's smaller, a bit more restrained, but exquisite. And what I love about the Patani style is that you have a very, very densely decorated frame around the text, but you have a lot of white around it. Well, it would have been white, except this is quite an old manuscript, and you see how stained it is with damp, and it's a bit brownish. But you very much get a feeling that the artists, they were influenced by the placement of the decoration on the page and the contrast with the space around it. The space itself was manipulated to set off the art, and this is a very, very nice feature of Patani art. If we move on to Java, there's not a single, one single style that you could call the Javanese style of Quranic illumination, because there are so many different styles in Java. And often in general, if I can't immediately identify where a Quran manuscript comes from, there's a chance it's from Java. But I've chosen just one Javanese Qur'an manuscript from the collection of the Bait al-Qur'an and Museum Istiqlal in Jakarta, which is part of the Ministry of Religious Affairs, because it illustrates one feature which is actually unique to Java. You don't tend to see it anywhere else, which is that throughout the Islamic world, illuminated Qur'ans are usually symmetrical about the central gutter. So you have the illumination on the three outer sides of each of the two facing pages, but it's always symmetrical about the central gutter. But in Java, you have a number of Qur'ans, not all of them, but some, which are not only symmetrical about the gutter, but also symmetrical on each page, like in this one. So you have two completely mirror images, obviously different text in the middle, but the decoration is symmetrical around the central axis of each page, as well as about the gutter. So that's just one feature of some Qur'an manuscripts from Java. But all the ones I've shown you up till now are all 19th century. So while the first sort of stage of my work on the art of the Qur'an in Southeast Asia was delineating and identifying these different regional styles, after a while it became clear that 90% of surviving manuscripts from the Nusantara are from the 19th century. I think there was greater availability of fine European paper on which they're all written. But it also raised the question of what was happening before the 19th century. We've already talked about Islam being present for many centuries. And so the next stage of my research was trying to sort of delineate on with more detail on a chronological basis. And there are very, very much far fewer manuscripts from before the 19th century. They only date really from about the 17th, around 1600 through to the from that period onwards. And what happened before 1600 is still a big mystery for us. But I think access to paper is one of the key. So it's for an economic historian, these are trading routes and how paper was supplied and accessible. But if we could look at the last slide in this small series, what I'd like to show you now is a Qur'an which is what I call the Sulawesi diaspora geometric style. And this is a sort of group of Qur'ans which is associated with an earlier period, with the 17th and 18th centuries. They are very distinctive because they have very stark geometrical outlines, sort of circles, triangles, vertical lines, not the kind of undulating ogival arches that you find everywhere in the 19th century. And this Qur'an is dated very clearly 1740. It's held in the museum in Riau in Pekanbaru, and it was actually copied by a scribe from Yemen, from Zabid, the town of Zabid in Yemen. There's a colophon naming the scribe as Ibrahim from Zabid. So it's a small network, a clump of Qur'ans that date from about the late 17th century throughout the 18th century. Found all over the Nusantara, but they all share this style of illumination. So it reflects the fact that there was a sort of network, a sort of intellectual, theological, but probably also political network, because these Qur'ans are mostly linked with royal courts of the region. That sort of maybe they were exchanged through Sufi networks, perhaps from the sheikhs at each of the royal courts. So it's still, the picture is not entirely clear, but so from the large number of illuminated manuscripts in the 19th century, we're trying to delve and see what pictures the earlier periods show us. And we still find very fine Qur'ans, but in much smaller numbers. We're talking about maybe from the 17th and 18th centuries, no more than about 50 or so Qur'ans, whereas there might be about around 1,000 from the 19th century. So that's, there's a lot of work to be done. There's space for everyone. It's a big party. There's a lot that can be done in this field.
Amazing. And speaking about palaces and early Qurans, I wanted to ask you about one of the earlier, examples that I came across, and this is from right now in the Yogyakarta Palace. And this is interesting because it also kind of recurs with the Raffles story, knowing that manuscripts were also deeply entangled with the colonial encounters. And could you share the story of manuscripts and how it was caught in the British attack of Yogyakarta in 1812. And how significant were the Qur'ans versus the Javanese manuscripts with this sort of historical context?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the early 19th century in Southeast Asia, saw a sort of conglomeration of lots of waves which had a particular very, very strong impact on writing culture. It was the age of the Enlightenment in Europe, with a particular focus on written works as reflections of civilizations. And it just also happened to be a time when, within the East India Company, which played such a major political and military role as well as a trading role, a mercantile role, not just in India but in Southeast Asia, it so happened that a number of East India Company officers were very much influenced by Enlightenment ideas, with an interest in writing cultures. I mean, prominent among the names, of course, Stamford Raffles, but he was not alone. So there are about 3 others in his cohort. John Crawford, who worked with Raffles in Penang and latterly in Java. Colin Mackenzie, an engineer who was sent from Java. And John Leyden, a colleague and a mentor to Raffles. And dealing with, there are others who are much more better equipped to speak on this than me, Farish Noor, Peter Carey, but resulting from the spillover of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, which across the Indian Ocean arena and into Southeast Asia. By 1810, 1811, the French Napoleonic forces were in control in Java, and so British forces, led by working under directives from the head of the East India Company, the Governor General in Bengal, Lord Minto, and acting on advice from Raffles, put forward a military campaign to capture Java from the Franco-Dutch ruling power. And so the British invaded Java in August 1811 and captured it after a very fierce military battle, and established themselves as the new ruling colonial power in Jakarta, what's now Batavia. And straight away the scene was set for a confrontation with the Sultan of Yogyakarta, who was as irascible as the British resident John Crawford, and the intransigence, and Crawford was not known even amongst his peers as an easy man. It led to a moment of conflict, and in June 1812, British forces militarily attacked the palace of Yogyakarta. There was great loss of life and great destruction, and the palace was ransacked, and all the valuables were taken out. According to the engagement rules at the time, the valuables of the palace, the gold, the diamonds, the treasury, was treated as prize, which was a legal term for war booty that was to be divided amongst the victorious army according to the rank of, so the general would get the bigger share, the lieutenants would get a certain share, and each individual soldier would get a smaller share. But I think it's one of the first times in an engagement in Southeast Asia where the library of the palace was also ransacked because of the presence of these individual officers, Raffles, Mackenzie, Crawford, who had an interest in collecting manuscripts. And so the library of the Palace of Yogyakarta was emptied. Raffles, as the senior official, was apparently given first pick, but he only 2 manuscripts in Raffles's collection today can be attributed to the Palace of Yogyakarta. The majority of the library was divided up between John Crawford and Colin Mackenzie, and they went their different routes, but in fact those 2 libraries have come back and are now both held in the British Library. For most of our knowledge about the British attack on Yogyakarta and the detailed reconstruction of what happened and how it happened, we are indebted to the historian Peter Carey, who has used a variety of sources, both Javanese and and European archival sources to piece together the stories of what happened. And it's thanks to Peter Carey's work that we can now, say more confidently what happened. And one of the things that becomes very clear, this is from eyewitness reports at the time, is after the attack on Yogyakarta and the emptying of the palace library, 3 manuscripts were left in situ. And the 3 were the Surat Surya Raja, which is a really the most important royal text in Yogyakarta to this day, which is still held in the palace of Yogyakarta. A copy of Arjuna Viwaha, an old Javanese text, and this Qur'an manuscript. There were also 2 other manuscripts which Raffles gave to the prince who became the first Paku Alam, because he said that one of those had been stolen from him by the Sultan of Jogja, so Raffles gave it back to him, Paku Alam, since he was a British ally, and together with another manuscript. But I'm so glad you've put up this manuscript, because it tells lots of different stories. Firstly, from the British side, the British had very little interest in Islam, so people like Raffles and Crawford and Mackenzie, they were obsessed with the classical past of Java, the great monuments of Borobudur and Prambanan, which to them most closely, fitted in with their sort of classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome and the statuary and the grand monuments in stone. They saw Islam as a negative force which had done away with the building of great monuments and with a greater sort of and which also affected the production of sort of beautiful manuscripts and things like that. And so there are almost no Qur'an manuscripts in British collections from collectors of this period. There's not a single Qur'an in Raffles's collection at all. So you can imagine that it was kind of like a no-brainer. He said, "Oh, you want the Qur'an, you can have it." But it's wonderful that this Qur'an is still held in Jogja, because it is an exceptionally important Qur'an. In terms of its calligraphy and illumination, it is superlative. It's also produced in 2 volumes, and that's very unusual in Qur'an manuscripts in Southeast Asia. It's just one of these codicological details which is very interesting for us. It's also very interesting because it has a full colophon written in Javanese. The colophon is the part of a manuscript which tells you who wrote it, when it was written, and for whom, or as many details as you like about the creation of the manuscript. And it's very, very rare to find colophons in Southeast Asian Qur'ans. I would have said no more than 1 or 2% have full colophons, so it's that rare. And this Qur'an gives very clearly the date it was written. Also, it tells you exactly how long it took to create this manuscript. But the other interesting thing is this manuscript was not written in Yogyakarta. It was written in Surakarta, but for a princess who then became part of the Jogja royal family. So it's also a very interesting example of how manuscripts moved, and manuscript cultures were shared often through family or links or royal marriages, and how they came to different places, because there are very, very few examples of illuminated manuscripts known from Surakarta, the royal household of Surakarta of Solo. And this, although it's the premier Yogyakarta manuscript, should be seen as reflecting the manuscript art of Surakarta at the time.
Amazing. So thankfully they left this behind, but just to give an idea to the viewers and listeners, what was really desired for was actually manuscripts like this.
Yes, so this is one of the 2 Javanese manuscripts from the court of Yogyakarta, which are in the Raffles collection and now held in the Royal Asiatic Society. And this manuscript was on display for the first time at the Asian Civilizations Museum exhibition on Raffles a few years ago. So it's a very beautiful manuscript and very typical. It's a very, very beautiful example, a typical example of the Jogja style of manuscript illumination of the time.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Gallop, for breaking down Qur'ans and the manuscripts for us. So I just wanted to just fast forward a little, and I was inspired by your 2015 essay on the appreciation and study of Quran manuscripts from Southeast Asia, past, present, and future. Well, you also note how contemporary artists such as Ed Pirius that we have here. Early on, we saw a piece by Ahmad Sadali from Indonesia. And then we also have Syed Ahmad Jamal in Malaysia, how they reimagine Quranic manuscripts in their work. So as a way to sort of, conclude our discussion today, could you share how you see these modern engagements reflect continuity with traditional form?
Yes, I mean, in the Nusantara today, Islamic calligraphy, Arabic calligraphy is a really thriving art, not just for calligraphy, but in modern art as well. And there's a real engagement, and Southeast Asian Nusantaran calligraphers win international prizes for calligraphy. However, as a historian of manuscripts, for me, one of the slightly sadder aspect is that nearly everyone who studies calligraphy in Southeast Asia today studies the Ottoman style of calligraphy. And there's a bit of a break with the past. My colleague Ali Akbar, a great calligrapher himself and a scholar of Southeast Asian Qur'ans, he was the first to sort of identify this dichotomy and to point out the break with the past in modern calligraphy today. And that's why I like the works by Piraus, who's from Aceh, an artist from Aceh, because you often find the links with the past still explicit in his artworks. So some of his earlier artworks actually were collages which involved pages of manuscripts from Aceh, 19th and 18th century manuscripts incorporated into the artwork. And this one that we have is very clearly inspired by the wonderful treasury of tombstones in Aceh with superb calligraphic inscriptions. And it also brings us full circle, because when we said, why aren't there Qur'an manuscripts from Nusantara before about 1600? It's the tombstone, the treasury of tombstone architecture, particularly from Aceh, where you have Quranic verses in superb calligraphy inscribed on stone from the 14th and 15th century that give us the much needed sort of link, the missing link with how the Quran was transmitted in these Islamic states of Nusantara before the wide availability of paper led to the creation of fine Quran manuscripts.
Amazing that these modern art forms still carry on those legacies. And well, as a concluding question, and having explored fields, manuscripts, and art, what do these written forms ultimately tell us about how power, faith, identity were intertwined in the Nusantara, and how do they continue to help us understand the region today?
Well, I think the wonderful thing about manuscripts is that sort of each one is a kind of building block of the past. I think sometimes we're just grasping at in almost thin air and creating sort of castles in the air and with lots of competing and very different narratives. But when you work with manuscripts, each one is a testament, a real testament or a witness to the past. It's something you can grasp and hold on to and said, this is what was created 200, 300 years ago. This is what they said. And if we can understand and study and interpret what was said as clearly and correctly as possible, this gives us a firm footing on which to build a better and more accurate and truthful concept of the past.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Gallop, for summing that up so poetically and beautifully. And with that, we've come to the end of our session. And I'd like to thank you again for sharing your insights and illuminating for us the power of the written word in the Nusantara through historically important artifacts. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Annabel Gallop, Head of Southeast Asia at the British Library. And you can listen to this episode fully. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And if you really enjoy it, please show your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing. And it really helps us bring more compelling insights like this on Norse Nusantara. Thank you again, Dr. Annabel Gallop.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to this episode of Norse Nusantara. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to this podcast to hear more from leading thinkers and creators on picturing the Nusantara.